Skeletons. I've always been fascinated by them since a young age, probably dating back to old Disney and Fleischer cartoons like The Skeleton Dance and Swing You Sinners. Since I have an odd fascination with them, I thought I'd pick out some of my personal favorite skeletons that have appeared in games. This is a list I could have saved for Halloween time, but Halloween is my favorite holiday, so I like to celebrate horror themes throughout the entire year. Skeletons are a common enemy found in countless games. Now, I'm aware that there's other skeletons that have appeared in games that aren't going to make it on my list. These are just the ones that really resonated with me personally. Anyway, let's get to it, shall we? This is Cinemassacre's Top 10 Boners. Number 10, Dry Bones. Dry bones are the skeletal versions of the Koopa Troopas usually found in castles. He originated in Super Mario Bros. 3 on the NES. Dry Bones has made appearances in tons of Mario games over the years. He even made an appearance in Hotel Mario on the Philips CDI, one of the few semi-decent games for the system. Now, these undead fiends collapse when attacked, but soon revive themselves. Very similar to the red skeletons in Castlevania. Strange that two skeleton enemies have the same regeneration character trait. My favorite guy in Super Mario Kart has always been to use Koopa Troopa, so I always thought it was a shame that Dry Bones wasn't a playable character in Mario Kart 8, though sometimes he does appear in the background, like on Bone Dry Dunes. In Super Mario World on the Super Nintendo, Dry Bones can actually be defeated permanently if you use the cape or the star power-ups, which is kinda neat. The thing about Dry Bones that I always loved was the noise that he makes when you stomp on his head. It's one of the most recognizable and memorable noises in video game history. Number 9, the Area 6 boss in Super C. What can be said about Contra that hasn't already been said? It's one of the greatest franchises of all time. The games are intuitive to pick up and play, and they get difficult very fast. The hardest in the franchise is probably Contra Hardcores on the Sega Genesis. One of the things that makes the game so great are the amazing boss fights. Helicopters, UFOs, giant robots, machines that look like Optimus Prime, you name it, you're gonna be fighting it. One of the best bosses is the Area 6 boss from the second game in the series, Super C. When you approach there's a bunch of skull heads with spiky teeth all mashed together that you quickly dispose of with spread. But just when you think it's over, everything begins to shake, the game keeps you in suspense. What ominous foe approaches? And then, a giant grinning skull head emerges. It's hilarious. Look at that huge shit-eating grin on his face. How can you not love this bonehead? Number 8, Electrocution in Street Fighter II. Yeah, let's talk Street Fighter. My favorite character from the Street Fighter series was Chun-Li. I always used her when fighting against my friends, but Blanka was the one that gave us an endless supply of dead bodies by way of electrocution. He could charge up his body with enough voltage to incapacitate his opponents, revealing their bony skeletal structures underneath. Incredible. Even though there was no specific skeleton character in Street Fighter II, make no bones about it, when playing this game, your TV was lit up with an endless supply of awesomely illuminated skeletons. Number 7, the skeleton in the lake from Shadowgate. Yes, Shadowgate. Originally released for the Macintosh, as a kid I was familiar with the NES version. Clearly, games like Deja Vu, Maniac Mansion, and Shadowgate were all games that were intended to be played with a mouse. Playing on a console, you have to use the D-pad, which is an underwhelming experience. Regardless, Shadowgate caught my attention because of its horror theme. You play as a hero who's trying to stop an evil warlock from summoning a behemoth from out of hell. To proceed through this castle, you have to solve a series of puzzles, and there's a variety of ways that you can be killed. Pretty much any action taken that isn't the correct response to the puzzle will result in your death. Then, it's back to the last save point you go. It's almost as much fun finding different ways to die as it is trying to find the right path to proceed, because you'll be curious to know all the different ways you can be killed. It's kinda like Star Wars chess. You want to get killed by all the characters just to see what'll happen. One of the great parts about the game is the skeleton holding the key in the lake. You walk by him many times and he just looks funny. It looks almost like he's taking a bath, but he's holding a key which you have to figure out how to get. Only by placing an orb in the water can you freeze the lake so that you can walk out and retrieve it. He's my favorite, but there's also the Grim Reaper that appears whenever you die. If you've never played before, you're going to be seeing his face a lot. Number 6, the giant skeleton boss from Castlevania 64. Castlevania is one of my favorite franchises, but Castlevania 64 was my least favorite game in the series. The transition from 2D to 3D was pretty terrible. I remember buying this game when it came out, bringing it home and being very disappointed, largely by the atrocious camera angles. Also the background scenery, which was so bland and featureless, it made it easy to get lost. I will say though, the disappointment didn't come immediately. I actually thought the first stage was pretty decent. For me, it wasn't until later in the game when it started to get really poor. On the first stage, you're finding switches to flip, which open gates to new areas, where you have to find another switch. It's fun at first, but it gets old when you realize that that's a large majority of what you're going to be doing throughout the game. The designers seem to be content making most of the level design hordes of constantly respawning weak enemies, combined with jumping over pits which were instant kills. And that happens frequently because of the bad camera angle positioning. The only thing saving the game was its somewhat interesting boss battles, but there's so much garbage between each boss, you don't even want to bother. Early on in the game, I actually thought the first boss was pretty cool. A gigantic bone-wielding skeleton. You can't go wrong there. You fight him twice on the first level. The first time he runs off, and then the second battle occurs at the end of the stage. The way that he moves around with his arms hanging down, I have to imagine that these are the bones of a giant ape, like King Kong. I know that there's plenty of other skeletons in the Castlevania franchise to choose from. This guy just always sticks in my memory for some reason. Maybe it's the skeletons on motorcycles. Number 5, Skullmageddon from Double Dragon Neon. Double Dragon was always one of my favorite beat-em-up franchises on the NES and in the arcade. The first NES game was a classic. The controls were a bit weird, but you get used to them quickly enough, and the versus mode is hilarious. One of the funniest things to do was make two Abobos crash into each other. The second game in the series was my favorite because it was co-op. Playing side by side with a friend made the game even more enjoyable than the first, though it was still very difficult. After that was Double Dragon 3, Battletoads in Double Dragon, Super Double Dragon, and even a version on Neo Geo CD, of all things. But then the franchise disappeared for many, many years. Finally, in 2012, the series got rebooted with Double Dragon Neon. It was a good throwback to the old games, and it thankfully retained the two-player local co-op, which is slowly and unfortunately becoming a foreign concept in the modern era of gaming. And you know, I do have to wonder if the designers were watching AVGN when they threw in that Bimmy and Jammy reference. But the best part is the main enemy in the game, Skullmageddon. Skullmageddon! He's an undead sorcerer that sounds exactly like Skeletor. You're breaking my bone! And it's perfectly fitting since Double Dragon is such an 80s stylized game. He teleports around, hurls flaming skulls, and pretty much fucks up anybody in his way. But if that's not enough, in his final form, similar to Mechagodzilla, he becomes Giga Skullmageddon, an advanced robot equipped with lasers. Amazing. Coming in at number 4, we got Scorpion from Mortal Kombat. Here's one that I probably don't even need to explain because the character is so famous. Scorpion has to make the list because he's usually who I am when I play the game. Well, either him or Baraka. Scorpion's most famous character trait is his spear weapon, which is attached to a rope. That's basically his stinger, which is why he's called Scorpion. Well, that, and sometimes he even turns into a scorpion. At first glance, he doesn't look like a skeleton because he's got so much gear on. His face is covered in a mask, so it's really only when he removes the mask for a fatality that you find out his true form. A blazing skull head. You might be wondering how he can even be alive if his head is reduced to a fleshless skull. The answer is that Scorpion is immune to death because his soul is bound by revenge. Fatality. Another one of his fatalities is the Hand from Hell, where he raises his arm up and summons a giant fiery skeletal claw that emerges from the ground and crushes his opponent's bones. Another one I really like is when his spear pushes an enemy into the lava, and after that, he pulls the spear back and it tosses the victim into a column with bloody skeletons, and then the skeletons rip the person apart. Even more ridiculous is when he plays the Jack-in-the-Box, but instead of a creepy clown popping out, it's a skull head. Scorpion could have been my number 1 pick, but since he spends so much time with his mask and armor on, I don't want to place him quite at the top of the list. Still, he's one of my favorites. Scorpion wins. Number 3, Spinal from Killer Instinct. Walking into an arcade in the mid-90s, Killer Instinct stood out because of its exceptional frame rate, detailed stages, and amazing character designs. It took some of the best aspects from Street Fighter and Mortal Kombat and added an even deeper combat system. Every stage is candy for the eyes. The finishers are great, and the humiliations are hilarious. There was Killer Instinct on the Super Nintendo and Killer Instinct Gold on the N64, but neither really lived up to the arcade versions. And somehow, Killer Instinct even made its way onto the Game Boy. When the arcade games were out, fans of the series were dreaming about having that amazing arcade experience in their own homes. Well, their dreams were becoming nightmares with garbage like this. Fortunately, in recent years, the series was rebooted for the Xbox One. One of the signature characters in the franchise is Spinal, an undead pirate skeleton who wields a curved sword, clearly inspired by Jason and the Argonauts. Much like Raiden in Mortal Kombat, Spinal also has the ability to teleport, or should I say, skeleport, sinking into the ground and rising behind his opponent. Countless hours can be spent learning all the moves in these games. There's ultra combos, no mercy, combo breakers, it's crazy. There's tons of awesome characters in this series to choose from. You got Cinder, Saberwolf, Raptor, but I've always been partial to Spinal. For me, he'll always be bad to the bone. Number 2, Stalfos from The Legend of Zelda. There is no way I could get through a list of video game skeletons without mentioning Stalfos. Now, they're pretty basic, just skeletal warriors that attack with swords or maces. They first appear on the first dungeon of the original Zelda. They wander around kinda aimlessly, and they're easily killed. In the second quest, though, they become a little bit more difficult because they attack with sword beams that can be hard to avoid. In Zelda 2, The Adventure of Link, the Stalfos act a bit different, since now it's a side-scrolling game. They come in either red or blue and can do a down thrust maneuver with their swords, just like Link can. They appear again in A Link to the Past on Super Nintendo. They also now have the strange ability to detach their skulls from their bodies, hurling them at Link. Now, the most bare-bones approach that you can take to killing a Stalfos like this are just to throw an empty pot in their face. Larger Stalfos knights also appear in the game, but they're easily dispatched by bombs. Another variation of these skeleton enemies are in Ocarina of Time. Here, though, they often battle in pairs. Link has to wait for them to let their guard down in order to land a strike. They'll also now do a jump attack. Again, you have to time your strikes at the right moment in order to hit them. Certainly a much more complicated fighting mechanic than in previous installments of the series. In Legend of Zelda The Wind Waker, Stalfos now hobble around while swinging giant maces. What you do is you fight them with bombs. You put the bomb down and then wait for it to explode, and then attack their head with your sword. Once enough damage is done to the skull, it shatters into fragments. So the skulls just bounce around the room, and if you don't kill them fast enough, its body will reassemble, and you have to do it all again. There's many other examples of these guys in games, but the point is, Nintendo's done a great job over the years of giving the audience new twists to the Stalfos gameplay mechanics to keep it fresh. They would be my number 1 pick if it weren't for the fact that Stalfos and Zelda aren't very scary, and evil skeletons should be terrifying. And now for my number 1 favorite skeleton in any video game, the Revenants in Doom 2. Why are they my favorite skeleton above all the other ones? They're fucking scary. I've always felt that skeletons should have a good scream. Maybe that's because I'm a fan of the So Bad It's Good 1958 film, The Screaming Skull, but these bastards have a shriek that'll shatter your soul. Listen to that. Oh, I can feel it in my bones. But the terrifying scream isn't the only reason these guys are badass. According to the manual for Doom 2, it says, apparently when a demon dies, they pick him up, dust him off, wire him with some combat gear, and send him back into battle. That perfectly describes these guys. The name Revenant actually means one who runs in French. Also fitting because when these guys see you, not only do they shriek, but they come charging at you like madmen. The way they run has this jerky movement, almost like a puppet on strings, which is creepy. When you encounter one in the game, they're actually very startling because you'll just be walking around, killing imps, no big deal. Next thing you know, you got missiles flying towards you. And if they do manage to run all the way over to you, they start to punch you in the face. They're totally insane. Another thing that's great about these guys is that if there happens to be 2 of them in the room, they'll start beating the shit out of each other, and it's fucking hilarious to just sit and watch. The Revenants might not be as dangerous as some of the other monsters in Doom 2, like the Spider Masterminds or the Cyber Demons, but they are fast and frightening. They get my pick as the number 1 because they honestly scare the hell out of me.